The blood on the Persian rug was still wet when Amelia Davis found her employer's body. She stood frozen in the doorway of the library, her cleaning supplies trembling in her hands as she stared at the crumpled form of Theodore Teddy Blackstone, the pharmaceutical billionaire who had given her a chance when no one else would. His reading glasses lay shattered beside him, and a half-finished letter was scattered across the mahogany desk. Words she couldn't quite make out from where she stood, paralyzed by shock and grief. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 7 o'clock, its deep brass notes echoing through the mansion's halls like a funeral dirge. Amelia had arrived early, as she always did, to begin her work before the family stirred. The Blackstone estate in Lincoln Park was a monument to American success. 40 rooms of marble and mahogany, crystal and gold, everything that money could buy except the one thing Teddy had valued most, peace of mind. Hello friends, thank you so much for stopping by. Please support me by subscribing to my channel, like and share this video to your family and friends. I truly appreciate your kind heart. So, let's begin. Amelia had seen blood before, but never like this. Growing up in Detroit's Corktown, she'd seen her share of violence. Her father had died in a factory accident when she was 12, leaving her mother to raise 3 children on a seamstress's wages. She'd watched her older brother Marcus struggle with addiction, had held her grandmother's hand as cancer ate away at her dignity, along with her savings. But this was different. This was Teddy, the man who had hired her 5 years ago when she was a single mother with a criminal record, desperate for work to support her dying grandmother and 8-year-old son. The man who had quietly paid for her grandmother's cancer treatments without ever mentioning it. The man who had encouraged her to take night classes at community college while she scrubbed his floors. The man who remembered her son's birthday and asked about his baseball games, who treated her like family when his own family barely acknowledged her existence. Mrs. Davis. The voice belonged to Detective Ray Morrison, who had arrived with the paramedics after she'd called 911 with shaking fingers. She turned to see his weathered face studying her with the careful attention of a man who had spent 20 years reading people's secrets. Morrison was old-school Chicago police, the kind of cop who still knocked on doors and looked people in the eye when he asked hard questions. But Amelia barely heard him. Her mind was racing back to the conversation she'd overheard 3 nights ago, when she'd been working late and heard angry voices coming from Teddy's office. She'd recognized the voice of his son, David Blackstone, cold, calculating, nothing like his father. They'd been arguing about the company, about money, about secrets that could destroy everything Teddy had built. "The board won't stand for it, Dad," David had hissed through the heavy door. "You'll ruin us all." "Some things are more important than profits," Teddy had replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "I won't let innocent people die for our bottom line." "Then you're a fool. A dead fool." At the time, Amelia had assumed it was just another family argument about business. Rich families fought about money the way poor families fought about bills, with the same passion, just different numbers. But now, staring at Teddy's still form, those words took on a sinister new meaning. "He was a good man," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He was trying to do the right thing." Detective Morrison's pen paused over his notepad. "What do you mean by that, Mrs. Davis?" That's when Amelia realized she might be the only person who knew the truth about what Teddy Blackstone had been planning to reveal, and why someone had wanted him dead. The Blackstone mansion became a crime scene overnight, yellow tape transforming the elegant foyer into something from a nightmare. Amelia watched from the kitchen as forensics teams photographed every surface, collected every fiber, turned Teddy's private sanctuary into evidence in their sterile bags. Victoria Blackstone, Teddy's wife of 32 years, sat in the sunroom like a porcelain doll, her face a mask of appropriate grief. She had always been cold to Amelia, treating her with the distant politeness reserved for necessary but unpleasant servants. Now she seemed even more remote, as if Teddy's death was simply another inconvenience to be managed by her army of assistants and lawyers. "The funeral arrangements need to be perfect," Victoria was saying into her phone, her voice steady despite the tragedy that had befallen her family. "Theodore's reputation must be preserved. Any hint of scandal would be devastating to the company stock." David Blackstone paced the marble floors like a caged predator, his expensive Italian shoes clicking in a staccato rhythm that set Amelia's nerves on edge. At 35, he was everything his father wasn't. Ruthless, where Teddy had been kind, greedy where Teddy had been generous. He had his mother's sharp features and cold blue eyes, the kind of man who saw people as either assets or obstacles. "The police are asking too many questions," he muttered to someone on his phone. "We need to control the narrative before this gets out of hand." Amelia moved through the house like a ghost, cleaning up after the investigators, trying to restore some semblance of normalcy to a world that had been turned upside down. But everywhere she went, she noticed things that others missed. The way David's hands shook when he thought no one was looking. The prescription bottles hidden behind books in Victoria's reading room. The unopened mail piling up on Teddy's desk, including several envelopes marked urgent and confidential. That evening, after the police had finished their initial investigation and the family had retreated to their separate corners of grief, Amelia found herself alone in Teddy's study. She knew she shouldn't be there. The room was still officially a crime scene, but something had been nagging at her all day. The letter on Teddy's desk, the one that had been scattered when she found his body, was gone now. The police had taken it as evidence, but Amelia remembered seeing other papers, documents that looked important. If Teddy had been planning to expose something damaging about his company, there might be more evidence hidden somewhere in this room. She began searching carefully, methodically, the way her grandmother had taught her to clean. Every corner, every crevice, nothing overlooked. Behind a row of leather-bound classics, she found a small safe built into the wall. The combination lock looked sophisticated, far beyond her ability to crack. But then she remembered something. Teddy's grandson, David's son Michael, had been staying at the house the previous month while his parents were divorcing. The boy was only 10, but he was smart and curious, always asking questions about everything. Amelia had caught him trying to get into his grandfather's safe one afternoon, claiming he was looking for birthday money. "It's easy, Mrs. Davis," Michael had said with the confidence of youth. "Grandpa uses the same numbers for everything. Mom's birthday, Dad's birthday, and mine. He says family is the combination to all his secrets." Amelia's fingers trembled as she entered the dates. 04-15-68, 08-22-88, 03-11-12. The safe clicked open. Inside was a treasure trove of documents that made her blood run cold. Internal company memos about a drug called Serenol, a new antidepressant that was making billions for Blackstone Pharmaceuticals. But the documents told a darker story. Test results showing dangerous side effects, clinical trials that had been manipulated, FDA reports that had been buried. People were dying from Serenol. Teenagers were committing suicide at rates far higher than normal. Elderly patients were suffering heart attacks. And Blackstone Pharmaceuticals knew about it all, had known for months while continuing to market the drug as safe and effective. At the bottom of the stack was a flash drive labeled insurance policy in Teddy's careful handwriting. Attached was a note. "For when they try to stop me from doing what's right. TB." Amelia understood now why Teddy had been killed. He had been planning to expose his own company, to sacrifice his fortune and his family's legacy to save lives. And someone very close to him, had murdered him to keep that truth buried. She pocketed the flash drive and carefully returned the documents to the safe, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd discovered. She was no longer just a witness to a crime. She was the keeper of secrets that could bring down one of America's most powerful corporations. Detective Ray Morrison had seen enough murder scenes to know when something didn't add up. Theodore Blackstone's death looked like a heart attack at first glance. A 67-year-old man found slumped over his desk. No obvious signs of violence. But the medical examiner's preliminary report told a different story. Digitalis poisoning, Dr. Sarah Kim explained as she led Morrison through the morgue. It's a heart medication, but in large doses it can cause cardiac arrest. The symptoms mimic a natural heart attack, which is why it's been used as a murder weapon throughout history. Morrison nodded grimly. How would someone administer it? Could be in food, drink, even absorbed through the skin with the right preparation. The killer would need access to the victim and some basic knowledge of chemistry. That narrowed the suspect list considerably. The Blackstone family had a full-time chef, but he'd been off duty the night of the murder. The only people with access to Teddy's private study were family members and Amelia Davis, the housekeeper who had found the body. Morrison had interviewed Amelia twice now, and something about her story bothered him. Not because he thought she was lying, quite the opposite. She seemed genuinely devastated by her employer's death, and her alibi was solid. She'd been at her son's parent-teacher conference until nearly 9 o'clock the night before, with dozens of witnesses to confirm her whereabouts. But Amelia knew something she wasn't telling him. Morrison could see it in the way her eyes darted away when he asked certain questions, the way her hands fidgeted with her purse strap whenever he mentioned the family business. "Mrs. Davis," he said during their third interview, "I need you to understand something. If you're protecting someone, if you think keeping quiet is the right thing to do, you're wrong. Mr. Blackstone deserves justice." Amelia looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "Detective Morrison, what if telling the truth puts other people in danger? What if the person who killed Mr. Teddy has the power to hurt anyone who gets in their way?" "Then we make sure they can't hurt anyone else," Morrison replied. "But I can't protect you if I don't know what we're dealing with." For a long moment, Amelia was quiet, weighing her options. Finally, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small object that made Morrison's pulse quicken. A flash drive. "Mr. Teddy left this for someone to find," she said quietly. "I think it's why he was killed." 3 weeks later, Amelia sat in the back row of the Cook County Courthouse, watching as David Blackstone's defense attorney painted his client as a grieving son, wrongfully accused. The lawyer was Harrison Vale, one of Chicago's most expensive criminal defenders, a man who had built his career on getting wealthy clients out of impossible situations. His silver hair and tailored suits spoke of old money and older connections, the kind of lawyer who played golf with judges and traded favors like currency. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Vale intoned, his voice carrying the educated accent of East Coast privilege, "we must ask ourselves, who benefits from Theodore Blackstone's death? Who had access to his private papers, his personal belongings, his most intimate secrets?" Every eye in the courtroom turned to Amelia, and she felt the familiar burn of shame and rage that had followed her since childhood. They were going to make her the villain in this story, just like they always did to people who looked like her, who came from where she came from. The prosecution's case was strong but not airtight. They had motive. David stood to inherit billions from his father's death. They had opportunity. He'd been in the house the night of the murder, claiming to have worked late in his home office. They even had some means. David's ex-wife had testified that he'd studied chemistry in college and had access to his father's heart medications. But they didn't have the smoking gun, the piece of evidence that would convince a jury to convict a billionaire's son of patricide. The flash drive Amelia had found was still hidden in her apartment, locked away in a shoebox under her bed. She'd told Detective Morrison about finding some documents, but she hadn't mentioned the drive itself. Something had held her back. A lifetime of learning not to trust the system. of watching people like her get crushed by people with money and power. Now, sitting in that courtroom, watching David Blackstone's expensive lawyers tear apart the prosecution's case with surgical precision, she realized her caution might have doomed any chance of justice for Teddy. The prosecution would have you believe that David Blackstone murdered his own father over business disagreements, Vale continued. But where is their evidence? Where are the witnesses, the documentation, the proof that this supposed motive even existed? Prosecutor Janet Rodriguez, a tough Cuban-American woman who had worked her way up from the public defender's office, fought back as best she could. But without the contents of that flash drive, she was fighting with one hand tied behind her back. Mr. Blackstone had everything to gain from his father's death, Rodriguez argued during her closing statement. Control of $1 billion company, freedom from his father's ethical constraints, the power to pursue profits over people. But Vale's response was devastating. Speculation, Your Honor, conjecture and character assassination. The prosecution has failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that my client committed this crime. In America, we don't convict people based on what they might have done or who we think they are. We convict based on evidence, and the evidence simply isn't there. As the jury filed out for deliberation, Amelia felt sick to her stomach. She had the evidence that could convict David Blackstone, could expose the conspiracy that had led to his father's murder. But using it would mean revealing how she'd obtained it. Would mean admitting to breaking into a safe, stealing documents that didn't belong to her. It would mean risking everything, her job, her freedom, her son's future, for a man who was already dead. That night, Amelia sat at her kitchen table in her small apartment on Chicago's South Side, staring at the flash drive. Her 13-year-old son Marcus was doing homework at the other end of the table, occasionally looking up at her with concern. "Mom, are you okay? You've been acting weird since Mr. Blackstone died." Amelia looked at her son, her brilliant, beautiful boy who wanted to be a lawyer someday, who believed in truth and justice with the fervor of youth. What kind of example was she setting by staying silent? What kind of world was she helping to create? "Marcus," she said quietly, "what would you do if you knew something that could help people, but telling the truth might get you in trouble?" Her son looked up from his algebra homework with the serious expression he wore when contemplating life's big questions. "I guess I'd ask myself which kind of trouble I could live with better. The trouble that comes from telling the truth, or the trouble that comes from staying quiet when people need help." Out of the mouths of babes, Amelia thought. Her son had just given her the answer she'd been searching for. "Mrs. Davis, you can't be serious." Public Defender Sarah Chen looked exhausted as she sat across from Amelia in the cramped courthouse cafe. At 35, Sarah had handled hundreds of cases, but nothing had prepared her for this, a housekeeper claiming to have evidence that could overturn a murder trial already in progress. Sarah had grown up in San Francisco's Chinatown, the daughter of immigrants who had sacrificed everything for their children's education. She'd worked her way through Stanford Law School, waiting tables and tutoring, driven by the same hunger for justice that had led her to the public defender's office instead of the corporate firms that had courted her. "I know what everyone thinks about me," Amelia said quietly, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "High school dropout, teenage mother, arrested for shoplifting when I was desperate to feed my family. But I'm not lying about this." Sarah studied the woman across from her. Amelia Davis was small and soft-spoken, the kind of person who moved through the world trying not to be noticed. But there was steel in her dark eyes, a determination that reminded Sarah of her own mother, who had cleaned office buildings to put her daughter through law school. "Even if what you're telling me is true," Sarah said carefully, introducing new evidence at this stage, "it's complicated. David Blackstone has the best defense team money can buy. They'll destroy your credibility, dig up every mistake you've ever made. They can try, Amelia replied. But I have something they don't, which is the truth. Sarah looked down at the flash drive Amelia had placed on the table between them. Such a small thing to hold such explosive secrets. If the documents were authentic, they would not only prove David Blackstone's guilt, but expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the pharmaceutical industry. Why come to me? Sarah asked. Why not go to the FBI, the media, someone with more resources? Amelia was quiet for a long moment, thinking of all the lawyers' offices where she'd been made to wait in hallways, all the police stations where her voice hadn't mattered, all the times the system had failed people like her. Because you're the only lawyer I've met who looks at me like I'm a person, not a problem, she said finally. And because Teddy Blackstone believed that justice shouldn't depend on how much money you have. Sarah felt something shift inside her, a recognition of the moment when a case becomes more than just work. If we do this, if we try to introduce this evidence, it's going to get ugly. They'll come after you with everything they have. Let them come, Amelia said simply. I've been poor, I've been scared, I've been dismissed and ignored, but I've never been a coward. That night, Sarah took the flash drive home to her cramped one-bedroom apartment and began the painstaking process of analyzing its contents. What she found made her blood run cold. The documents painted a picture of corporate malfeasance that went far beyond simple greed. Blackstone Pharmaceuticals had known about Serenol's deadly side effects for over a year, but had continued marketing the drug while suppressing negative test results. Internal emails showed David Blackstone leading the cover-up, bribing FDA officials, and threatening researchers who tried to speak out. But the smoking gun was a recorded phone conversation between David and his father, time-stamped just hours before Teddy's death. I won't let you destroy everything we've built, Dad. David's voice was cold, calculating. I built this company to help people, not to line our pockets with blood money, Teddy replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion and moral certainty. Then you've forgotten what business is really about. Maybe it's time for new leadership. David, I'm warning you. No, Dad, I'm warning you. Stay out of my way, or you'll regret it. The recording ended there, but it was enough. Combined with the financial documents and internal emails, it painted a clear picture of motive and intent. Sarah worked through the night, preparing motions and briefs, building the legal framework that would allow her to introduce this evidence in court. It was a long shot. Overturning a jury verdict based on new evidence was difficult under the best circumstances, and these were far from the best circumstances. But as she worked, Sarah found herself thinking about her mother, who had taught her that some fights were worth having, even when you couldn't win them. This was one of those fights. The courtroom was packed on the day Sarah Chen stood to address Judge Maria Santos about introducing new evidence. Media had gotten wind of the story, a Maid taking on a billionaire, explosive documents that could topple a pharmaceutical giant, and the public was captivated by the drama. Judge Santos was a tough Latina woman who had worked her way up from the public defender's office, earning a reputation for fairness and no-nonsense court management. She had been the first in her family to graduate college, the first to go to law school, the first to wear the black robes of judicial authority. She understood better than most what it meant to fight for justice from the bottom up. David Blackstone sat at the defense table, his expensive suit and confident demeanor unchanged despite the mounting pressure. His legal team had spent the previous weeks trying to discredit Amelia, hiring private investigators to dig into her past, threatening her with lawsuits for theft and defamation. But she had stood firm, her testimony clear and unshakable. Your Honor, Sarah began, her voice carrying the conviction of someone fighting for more than just a case. The evidence we seek to introduce is not only relevant, but essential to ensuring that justice is served. The defendant's own communications prove that he had both motive and means to commit this crime. Harrison Vale rose to object, his silver hair gleaming under the courtroom lights. "Your Honor, this so-called evidence was obtained through theft by a domestic employee with a criminal record and a clear vendetta against my client. The chain of custody is broken, the authenticity questionable, and the source completely unreliable." Judge Santos studied the motion before her, weighing the arguments. The legal precedents were complex. Evidence obtained illegally was usually inadmissible, but there were exceptions for cases involving public safety and imminent danger. "Mr. Vale," she said finally, "while the chain of custody is certainly unusual, I'm troubled by your characterization of Mrs. Davis. She's not on trial here, and her past mistakes don't automatically disqualify her testimony." Vale's face reddened slightly. "Your Honor, we're talking about someone who broke into a private safe, stole confidential documents. We're talking about someone who discovered evidence of mass murder," Sarah interrupted. "Evidence that shows hundreds of people have died because this defendant and his company chose profits over lives." Judge Santos called for a recess to review the evidence in chambers. During the break, Amelia sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, trying to calm her nerves. She could see David Blackstone through the glass doors, conferring with his legal team, occasionally glancing in her direction with undisguised hatred. "You're doing the right thing," Sarah said, sitting down beside her. "Am I?" Amelia asked. "My son's getting harassed at school. Reporters are camping outside my apartment. David Blackstone's people are digging through my entire life, looking for anything they can use against me." "That's what they do," Sarah replied. "They try to make you feel small, to make you believe that people like us don't get to stand up to people like them. But you're not small, Amelia. You're the most courageous person I've ever met." When court reconvened, Judge Santos had made her decision. "I've reviewed the evidence in chambers," she announced. "While the chain of custody is unusual, the documents appear authentic and speak directly to the defendant's state of mind and actions in the days preceding his father's death. More importantly, they reveal a pattern of criminal behavior that extends far beyond this single murder. I'm going to allow their introduction." The defense table erupted in whispered conferences, but Amelia felt a surge of hope. For the first time in her life, the system was working in her favor. "Mrs. Davis, isn't it true that you were arrested for shoplifting in 2019? Harrison Vale circled Amelia like a predator, his voice dripping with condescension as he began his cross-examination. Amelia sat straight in the witness chair, her hands folded in her lap. She had prepared for this moment, knowing they would use her past as a weapon. "Yes, sir. I stole formula and diapers for my son. I was desperate. Desperate enough to steal?" "Yes, sir." "And desperate enough to lie?" Sarah objected, but the damage was done. Vale pressed on, painting Amelia as an opportunistic criminal who had fabricated evidence to gain attention and money. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Davis, that you've been negotiating with book publishers about your story?" "Someone called me about that, yes, sir, but I haven't agreed to anything." "Because you're waiting to see how much money you can make from this tragedy?" "No, sir. Because I'm not doing this for money." Vale scoffed. "Then why? Why risk everything to insert yourself into a murder case that has nothing to do with you?" Amelia looked out at the packed courtroom, at the reporters and spectators and legal professionals who had dismissed her for so long. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. Because Mr. Teddy was a good man who was trying to do the right thing, even though it would cost him everything. He was going to expose his own company because people were dying from their drugs. His son killed him to stop that truth from coming out. She turned to look directly at David Blackstone. "I'm here because someone needs to speak for the dead, and for all the people who will die if this man goes free." The courtroom was silent as her words hung in the air, carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Vale tried to recover, attacking her credibility, her motives, her right to be in that courtroom at all. But with each question, Amelia's quiet dignity and obvious sincerity made his tactics look increasingly desperate and cruel. When Sarah stood for redirect examination, she had just one question. "Mrs. Davis, what do you hope to gain from all this?" Amelia thought about her son Marcus, about Teddy Blackstone, about all the people who had suffered while powerful men played games with their lives. "I hope that maybe for once, the truth will matter more than money. That maybe my son will grow up in a world where people like Mr. Teddy don't have to die for trying to do what's right." The prosecution's case was devastating. The recorded conversation between David and his father, played for the jury in David's own voice, was damning evidence of both motive and threat. The financial documents showed systematic bribery and corruption. The medical evidence proved that hundreds of people had died from Serenol, while Blackstone Pharmaceuticals knew the drug was dangerous. David Blackstone's defense crumbled under the weight of the evidence. His alibis fell apart, his explanations grew increasingly desperate, and his own arrogance began to show through his carefully constructed facade. On the final day of testimony, the prosecution called Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a former Blackstone researcher who had been fired for raising concerns about Serenol's safety. "I tried to warn them," Dr. Walsh testified, tears streaming down her face. "I told David Blackstone personally that the drug was killing people. He told me to keep quiet or find another job." "What did you do?" Prosecutor Rodriguez asked. "I documented everything I could, then tried to go to the FDA. But somehow David found out. I was fired the next day, blacklisted from the industry. My career was over." "Dr. Walsh, do you recognize this document?" Rodriguez showed her one of the papers from Teddy's flash drive. Dr. Walsh's face went pale. "This is my original report, the one that showed Serenol's connection to teenage suicides. I thought all copies had been destroyed." "Where would Theodore Blackstone have gotten this?" "He must have saved it. Mr. Blackstone, Teddy, he called me a few weeks before he died. Said he was going to make things right, that he wasn't going to let his son destroy any more lives." The jury heard it all. The cover-up, the deaths, the systematic corruption that had prioritized profits over human lives. They saw David Blackstone not as a grieving son, but as a calculating killer who had murdered his own father to protect a criminal enterprise. "We, the jury, find the defendant David Blackstone guilty of murder in the first degree." The words echoed through the courtroom like thunder, followed by gasps and sobs and the furious scratching of reporters' pens. David Blackstone's face went white as the reality hit him. Life in prison without possibility of parole, his empire crumbling, his father's truth finally exposed. Amelia felt tears streaming down her face as Sarah grabbed her hand. They had done it. Against all odds, against the power of wealth and privilege, they had found justice for Teddy Blackstone. But their victory was more than just one man's conviction. The pharmaceutical scandal that emerged from the trial documents made national headlines for months. The FDA launched investigations, congressional hearings were called, and families who had lost loved ones to Serenol finally had answers and hope for justice. The civil lawsuits came next. Hundreds of families suing Blackstone Pharmaceuticals for wrongful death, seeking not just compensation, but accountability. The company's stock price collapsed. Its executives were arrested, and the entire pharmaceutical industry found itself under unprecedented scrutiny. Amelia became the reluctant face of corporate whistleblowing. Her story inspired others to speak out against powerful injustice. She testified before Congress, appeared on newspaper ads, and worked as legislation was passed to protect people like her who risked everything to expose the truth. But her country came at a cost. Her quality life was shattered. Her son struggled with the media circus that surrounded their family, and the stress of constant scrutiny took its toll on both of them. There were threats from David Blackstone supporters, lawsuits from the pharmaceutical industry. Through it all, Sarah Chen remained her anchor and advocate, helping her navigate the legal and media landscape, protecting her from those who would exploit her story, and gradually becoming not just her lawyer, but her closest friend. 6 months after the trial, Amelia Davis walked across the stage at Malcolm X Community College, receiving her associate degree in paralegal studies. She had continued her education throughout the trial and its aftermath, determined to build a future based on knowledge and service rather than cleaning and scrubbing. Sarah Chen was in the audience, cheering loudly as the woman who had started as a maid became the first in her family to graduate from college. Marcus, now 15 and more determined than ever to study criminal justice, beamed with pride as his mother accepted her diploma. "What's next?" Sarah asked at the graduation party afterward, held in the community center where Amelia had first taken her GED classes. Amelia smiled, holding her diploma like the treasure it was. "Law school. There's a program at Chicago Kent for working adults. It'll take me 6 years going part-time, but..." She paused, thinking of Teddy Blackstone, of all the people who had died because powerful men had prioritized profits over lives. Some dreams are worth waiting for. Sarah raised her glass of punch. To justice delayed, but not denied. To speaking truth to power, Amelia replied. As they toasted, neither woman could have imagined that this case would become a landmark, studied in law schools across the country as an example of how courage and determination could overcome any obstacle. They only knew that they had fought for what was right, and won. 10 years later, attorney Amelia Davis stood in the same courtroom where she had once been dismissed as just a maid. But now she was arguing her own case, defending a young Latino man wrongly accused of armed robbery. The evidence was circumstantial, the deck stacked against her client, but Amelia had learned something important in that long-ago trial. The truth has a power all its own. Her law office in Pilsen was small but busy, serving clients who couldn't afford the big downtown firms but deserved the same quality representation. She specialized in cases involving corporate corruption and whistleblower protection, work that paid little but meant everything to her sense of purpose. In the gallery, she could see her son Marcus, now 25 and a prosecutor with the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. He had followed his mother's path into law, but from the other side of the courtroom, seeking justice through prosecution rather than defense. Beside him sat Sarah Chen, now a federal judge, who had taken a personal day to watch her former partner in action. And in the front row, in a wheelchair but still sharp as ever, sat Mrs. Eleanor Blackstone, Teddy's widow, who had become Amelia's biggest supporter and had established a foundation providing legal aid to low-income families. Eleanor had lost everything when David's crimes came to light, her fortune, her social standing, even her home. But she had found something more valuable in her friendship with Amelia: redemption. As Amelia presented her closing argument, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, from cleaning floors to defending the defenseless, from invisible to unstoppable. The little girl from Detroit who had once felt powerless had found her voice, and now she used it to speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves. The jury was still deliberating when a young public defender approached her in the hallway. "Ms. Davis, I'm Jennifer Reyes. I just wanted to say, you're the reason I went to law school. I read about your case, about how you refused to stay silent, and it inspired me to fight for justice, too." Amelia smiled, remembering another courthouse hallway, another scared young woman who had thought her dreams were impossible. "Keep fighting," she told Jennifer. "The system isn't perfect, but it can be bent toward justice if we're brave enough to push." Later that evening, after her client had been acquitted and the courthouse had emptied, Amelia walked through the marble halls one more time. She paused at the spot where she had first met Sarah Chen, where two unlikely allies had joined forces to take on one of America's most powerful men. The janitor was mopping the floors now, an older black woman who nodded respectfully as Amelia passed. For a moment, Amelia saw herself as she had been, invisible, dismissed, cleaning up other people's messes, while her own dreams gathered dust. But that woman was gone now, transformed by courage and determination into someone who could change the world, one case at a time. The little girl who had once cleaned other people's homes had learned to clean up injustice itself, and that, she knew, was the most important work of all. As she caught sight of herself in the courthouse window, a reflection that showed not just who she was, but all the people she had helped along the way, Amelia Davis smiled. The journey from maid to attorney had been long and difficult, filled with obstacles that would have defeated a lesser person. But she had learned something that no amount of money or power could teach, that true strength comes not from what you have, but from what you're willing to sacrifice for others. The ghost of Theodore Blackstone seemed to nod approvingly from the shadows, his faith in human goodness finally vindicated. Justice had been served, truth had triumphed over power, and a woman who had started with nothing had changed everything. In the end, that was the real victory. Not just convicting a killer or exposing corporate corruption, but proving that in America, even the most invisible among us could rise up and demand to be heard. The maid who saved a billionaire had ultimately saved something far more precious. The belief that justice was possible for everyone, regardless of where they came from or how little they started with. The courthouse lights dimmed as Amelia walked into the Chicago night, carrying with her the hopes and dreams of everyone who had ever been told they didn't matter. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, new opportunities to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. But tonight, she was simply a woman who had kept her promise to a dead man, who had turned tragedy into triumph, and who had proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply refusing to stay silent. Dear friends, thank you so much for watching. Please support me by subscribing to my channel, and don't forget to like and share this video. It means the world to me. Take care of yourself, and never forget how much you're loved. I can't wait to see you in the next video. Sending you all my love.